I'm Philip, CEO, co-founder of Gather, and Kumail here is one of my co-founders, CTO. And we work on Gather, which is because you see a little bit right there, but it's kind of our take on building the metaverse, kind of from a different angle. Cool. So I guess first to kind of describe what Gather is at all, the main interaction here, I can just open up Gather itself, is that you have this character on this 2D map. And also the aspect ratio is off, so you can't really see it all, but and you can move them around, and you actually see and hear the people right next to you. So right now we're at Kumail's desk here in our office, so we're talking. But if I walk away, we'll stop listening to him, and if I walk up to anyone else here in the office, we'd be talking to them instead. Yeah, so that's kind of like the main interaction, and kind of going further, kind of like the way to think about Gather is it's about spaces, not just like video chat. Right, so here are some examples. It's used across many different contexts. So this, for example, is like a university class using it for their office hours, or these are like two other offices that also use Gather and as their remote office, or like a party, for example, on a rooftop. And kind of it goes further than that, further than just like characters in a space and talking. There's a lot of like interactive objects too. So for example, like behind the scenes is really just embedding text or images or videos or web pages. But for example, you can like walk up to a whiteboard, and when other people walk up to it together, you collaborate on it. You can also have games, you can have TVs in your space, etc. One other huge component of Gather is like the customizability. So at the most basic level, we have this like map maker tool that people use. It's a Figma-like interface where you can like customize it however you want. And you see people creating like things that look, like our game, but also like it could be on a moon, or like this is actually like an Ethereum conference that got hosted on Gather, or like it can even look like a fantasy map.
Phil, this is a really old map maker screenshot.
Yeah, this is like 6 months ago. Yeah, but then like even going one step further, one thing that we have in beta is like being able to customize down to every single part of the game logic. So for example, people really wanted doors that you could put a password on so that people couldn't like, this is actually the reception area to our office lobby. And randos will come in all the time, and like our security team was like, hey, you need to put like a password, like a badge on the door. And so what that looks like is like, one of our engineers wrote this extension, which is basically like you can program exactly that behavior. So it can go down to programmable objects, but in the future, we'd really love to see like external game engines, right? Where internally we've prototyped like escape room games, or we're thinking about like laser tag, or Among Us in Gather. But it could really go, you can only enter this space if you have enough like ETH in your wallet or something like that. Like it should be as customizable as possible. Cool. And kind of the long term, really what we're doing this for, we're building the metaverse. And I think there's a lot of definitions of that out there today. So I'll define it. What that means to us is like this virtual layer over the physical world, where crucially a large portion of society can do quote unquote like real life. So you can go to work, you can go to school, interact with your communities, do all the sorts of things I showed before. And like the internet, we believe the metaverse will have many different browsers, many different web pages. It'll be composed of lots of people in the ecosystem working together, whether it be like businesses or individuals. And I come from the VR side, so one qualifier usually uses like our vision is like not really that of like Ready Player One, in the sense that in that fictional world, it was kind of a very separate world, one that was an escape from reality. In our case, we think it's more like harmonious and enriches like the real world. And another example of people who are making a lot of buzz are like Fortnite or Roblox. And in our case, like we believe a lot of the impact here is in not just the game aspect. Yeah, so I guess in terms of like why the metaverse at all, our mission is basically to help people access opportunities and community no matter where they live. On one sense, it's kind of like pretty crazy how the status quo before was like you kind of choose a place to work, and like people live 30 minutes within that place, and that's so many ramifications in terms of, you know, what was your relationship to your family, or like which communities could you be a part of, or even like the flip side of like which opportunities could you access in the first place, or like what kinds of people can work together. And so I think that's kind of like the first step, but I think the next step would be like, in the limit, creating new kinds of opportunities, interactions. So like jobs in the metaverse, I think this is probably the crowd that's probably thinks about that the most, about like virtual economies, or creators building virtual experiences and selling them and making their living off of that. We're thinking like new kinds of interactions, like, you know, virtual malls and virtual movie theaters and apartment buildings where people are kind of like around and interacting. And of course, all the stuff that other people are going to build that we just haven't imagined yet. So in terms of like our take, in terms of like how to get there, this is kind of like what we see as the dependency graph. So one, of course, there needs to be a platform that builders will build on top of. The builders will build the apps and experiences that then provide the actual concrete value to users. And I think the most interesting like two arrows on this graph are like the users to builders, where here it's kind of like all the kinds of builders that we want to have on here, they need to be incentivized to like believe that this is valuable enough. So I think one example I like to use, I always make it analogies to the internet, is when Jeff Bezos talks about starting Amazon, he was just like kind of working at some finance company, and he saw like the exponential growth of the internet, and he just thought like, I need to build some business on the internet. And I think we need to have some kind of similar loop going, where lots of people are coming onto the metaverse, and now people are like, whoa, like we can actually build these kind of things for them. And the other arrow that's kind of interesting is like the dependency between apps and experiences to the platform. And I think there we're just kind of saying there's so many examples of platforms that build without a use case in mind, and that like we're kind of being more deliberate on that side. And so our like take on kind of what the landscape looks like was that, you know, there's a lot of chicken and egg problems here in this diagram. And in order to kind of like push the metaverse forward, we ourselves will be the first builders on the platform and bootstrap a lot of this process. So like basically, I'm kind of saying like the world needs proof that the metaverse will be useful. Most people don't think, like, especially pre-COVID, didn't think that you could work remotely like super effectively. And you know, it's a hard sell to say like, hey, you can actually like interact really meaningfully through these virtual spaces. And kind of like, you know, our master plan beyond that is we're the first major builder. We build for the biggest concrete use cases. Iteratively, while we build those use cases, we improve the platform. And then now that we've gotten like way more users on the platform, that combined with, you know, the platform we've been developing will incentivize way more builders to come onto here. Cool. So yeah, in terms of our progress today, it's only been a year since we started, and so it's been pretty crazy. At this point, we have hundreds of thousands of people using our spaces every day, 10 million plus users total, and a lot of concrete progress on what I said were like the concrete use cases. So for example, companies like Notion or Uber or Pinterest or Coinbase have offices or like host events in our spaces. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of university campuses. So this is like someone who recreated like half of the U Chicago campus, and students would actually like go to classes in there or just like hang out in the Gather space. But we've also hosted events like Forbes 30 under 30 had a space in Gather, or Magic the Gathering recently like did a deck launch and built experiences in Gather. But also like on the builder side, which I'd say is really like the main KPI down the line, we have lots of map creators, people building like virtual amusement parks or like rock band performances or like recreating virtual bars. But then also like lots of businesses are now being built on Gather. So there's been like 20 plus businesses built on Gather. They're like at every part of the stack, whether it be like we provide services. Like this, for example, is a conference management company that got started on Gather. So just like in real life, how like there'd be some company that sets up the hotel correctly. Like this company will go set up the Gather space correctly. They'll hire like on the day support staff to show up and man booths. And they've made 500K in revenue in the first 5 months of business. That was awesome to see. Yeah. Okay. The next part is kind of like about with all this, we think a lot about like decentralization, and it's important to, as I mentioned, like the open metaverse vision. Cool. So we'll talk about it next few parts.
Cool. Yeah, I want to preface this whole section by saying that we're like a little bit far from actively decentralizing anything that we're working on currently. So like take everything that I'm saying with that in mind. That being said, we strongly believe that the future of the metaverse is very decentralized, and I think it's like pretty critical to the long term of it, or at least like the long term in like the optimal way. Like it won't necessarily go down this way, but the best version of the metaverse is one that's decentralized. And we want to build towards that. So why do we think this? The main reason we think this is because, well, like sort of like one of the core properties of the metaverse is that it's way too, like the ideal version of it is way more expansive than can be built by a single organization. Like you want people to be able to bring their own experiences into the metaverse, and be able to solve for use cases that one organization just can't think of. So it needs to be extremely extensible. And not only does it need to be extremely extensible in the sense of like, you know, we need to be able to, you know, have an API for other people to build on it, but also like other people need to be able to improve the platform. And sort of like the ideal world is one in which like there's competition and progress happening on all layers of the metaverse stack, from the viewers to the game logic to the experiences that are happening in the world to like things that avatars own and all of these different bits. And we'd like to create a world where like there can be innovation happening on all of these different parts, sort of in parallel, happening across multiple organizations, and none of it is owned by a single organization. We'd like to create something that's like closer to an internet than something like the iOS API, where there's these like well-defined protocols that people are sort of cohering around, and either side of the interfaces can change, and the interface itself can change, and all this sort of happens within the context of like many organizations and a healthy competition. You know, we sort of see things like in iOS, Apple very strictly controls the APIs that are exposed, and then as a result, you get slower innovation on the platform than on something like Android, where there's like more control given to people, and more things sort of get fucked with and innovated upon. And sort of like things that result from this perspective is like one other like property that sort of shows up here is the idea of neutrality. So one, you know, sort of problem that you see in these big centralized platforms is that the platform owner gets, you know, they have a monopoly on the platform, and they can sort of use their ownership over the platform to give themselves advantages in all kinds of ways. So like Apple apps, for example, are privileged and can do things that other apps on the iPhone can't. And so Safari is like always going to have powers that other browsers can. And innovation is sort of stifled in this way. Or, you know, like Apple will take like massive cuts on apps, and this like sort of hurts the economics of app development. And we'd like it to be the case where, you know, people aren't getting screwed. And like the long term of the metaverse is definitely one in which things are open and competition is free, and innovation is happening optimally. Sort of another thing that comes out of this is interoperability. Like if you design the platform in such a way that pieces sort of factor out nicely, and you know different implementations of different parts can reference the other parts, then you get some nice properties of like, you know, you can like share identity across different worlds in the metaverse that are owned by different people, in like a nice decentralized way. Or maybe you can like prove ownership of assets in one system in another system, and things like this. If you've built the overall architecture in such a way that identity and ownership sort of factor out, and you have this kind of interoperability. And then there's like something that kind of underlies all of this, which is like just like a principle of this being morally right. Like it sort of feels like the thing that we are trying to build is closer to like an internet style infrastructure project or like a World Wide Web style infrastructure project, which nobody should really own, and rather there should be this kind of competition. And so there's like, some kind of like underlying like best practice kind of thinking here, or like principle kind of thinking here, where like this is like the morally right way to be going about building a metaverse. Next slide. That being said, like given all this lofty thinking, there are like practical reasons why we can't decentralize now. In fact, like many reasons to worry about the future of decentralization in the metaverse generally, and things that we're going to need to be thoughtful about as we think about how to decentralize it. So in particular, like a couple of key problems that I'll call out right now. First of all, the idea of cohesion. When you have a centralized organization controlling the underlying platform, you can sort of dictate what the atoms are. You can, dictate things like, what is the viewer that people use? And like, then people who are building on it sort of get the guarantee that everyone who's using it is going to see it in a certain way. And maybe this is actually like desirable. Maybe like it's worthwhile for things to be consistent. But then if you like decentralize the viewing layer, then you lose this kind of cohesion. And you can't enforce this cohesion anymore because now you've got many viewers and you don't know who's using what. And there's this sort of problem here. It's like harder to dictate the UX. There's a problem of iteration speed. So once you like define a protocol, it becomes hard to change, since now people start relying on this protocol, or like this version of the protocol. And I'm sure I'm like preaching to the choir here. You guys like already know this, being Ethereum folk, but yeah, like once you've defined something, you can't just change it. Whereas like in a centralized world, you can just like dictate everyone has to move or else. Like there's no notion of forking. It's just like the centralized owner decides this is what the protocol is and that's it. And then the final sort of sticky problem, or like a third sticky problem that I'll call out right now, is the idea of governance and incentives. So with like a for-profit company like ours that we have right now, the incentives to sort of build the underlying platform and improve it are very clear, because, well, we get paid when people use it. Like we can just say, we charge this much money to use the platform and that's it. It becomes a little bit less clear where the incentives are and how we run governance of decentralized protocol. But this is not an unsolvable problem. It just comes with trade-offs. So this is another thing we'll have to think about. Next slide. Okay, so what does this practically look like for Gather right now? A little bit unclear. We don't, as I said, we haven't actually like made moves towards decentralization yet, but sort of like things that we're thinking about, you could imagine things like a shared identity layer, where maybe there's like multiple people operating many different kinds of virtual worlds, and they own the whole like implementation of those stacks, but there's some protocol by which you have shared identity, which can transfer between worlds, and you can like prove properties of people's identity in different worlds, or like things that they know in different worlds via this like shared system. You can imagine like a shared object ownership layer, maybe using something like NFTs, where you own some things in one world and maybe they can transfer over to other worlds via some system like this. Or maybe you can use the fact that somebody owns something in a different world in your system. And then some other thoughts are like just like defining open protocols for what interacting with a space looks like, or defining an open protocol for what a space looks like. So then you can do things like have different viewers for spaces, or different clients, like a VR client and a web client, and all of these things sort of are able to interoperate with each other in some interesting way. But yeah, very, very preliminary right now. And we're trying to figure out exactly what these things are going to look like in the long term. Then next slide. And sort of the way that we're thinking about this right now is like, given the problems with decentralizing upfront, and given the fact that we don't actually know what the underlying abstractions that we want are yet, what we want to do is build in a centralized manner upfront, where we sort of control the entire platform, but sort of treat this as like a bootstrapping project. And once we've, sort of gotten to some kind of like metaverse engine that we're confident with, then we can think about what are the protocols between different pieces of this system, and how do we open these up to the wider world for people to build on either side of. The thing that we want to be confident of here before we go and do this is that we actually have the right interfaces, so that we don't get like locked into things ahead of time before we know what we actually want. Another interesting thing that we're thinking about here is that we're building our organization in kind of like an internally decentralized way, in the sense that like we have teams inside the company working on like very different classes of users and sort of building on shared infrastructure. And then we have other teams who are sort of responsible for taking these teams as clients and building an underlying platform. And the idea here is sort of like, in order to build a platform, we actually need to have pressure to build a platform instead of like a big vertically integrated monolith, which would be the tendency if you only have like, one set of product priorities. But we sort of, we want it to be the case that there's like multiple apps building upon a shared gather platform, and then this shared gather platform has the right abstractions. And so we're doing this sort of like internally decentralized kind of thing, where there's like a bunch of product teams that are looking at different particular users, but they're each sort of empowered to change the UI in whatever way they want, or change the game mechanics in whatever way they want, or change properties of players in whatever way they want, change the interaction model in whatever way they want. And then it's the job of the platform teams to sort of build an underlying platform that can abstract, like provide good shared abstractions upon which all these things will build. And then sort of like the long-term idea here is that we can take this platform that the platform teams build, and then split out the different components, define protocols, make them decentralized. One important thing to keep in mind here, though, as we do this, is that internal teams are very different from external teams. There's a couple of major differences to call out. One super important difference is that there's a lot of trust internally in a way that you won't have for external teams communicating through protocols. Like, for example, one of the sort of protocols that we have internally right now is people just like modifying each other's code. Like if the remote work team wants to go implement some platform feature, well, they just like go and do it. And that's sort of like the protocol by which they work. But obviously this doesn't work in a low trust environment. And sort of like as we think about decentralizing, we need to think about how to move from high trust to low trust, and making these protocols, sort of more cognizant of that. And then the other thing here is that even if we have a lot of internal diversity, it's still not going to be nearly as much diversity as there would be if we opened it up to the wider world. Like we are still at the stage, for example, where if the platform team wants to make a change to an API, it's very easy for them to actually just go and change it in all of the consumers. In fact, they can just like we have a mono repo, and they can like go and control click on an API or like a function invocation, and then themselves just go and modify all the people who call it. But obviously, this is not something that you can do when you have external people using the protocol. And so now you need to think about like, how do you do releases, and how do you make sure backwards compatibility is there, and that things are upgradable in a nice way, and all this sort of thing. And so this sort of like pressure doesn't exist internally either. So we'll also have to be cognizant of that when we eventually move to decentralize.
Cool. So I guess the next part, like besides just talking about why decentralization is important, like how we're going to do it, the next part is kind of like why I think it's important to do it fast. And so I guess just the first part to that is just like the truth that like open platforms don't always win, right? Like I think one of the best examples is like, what the iPhones and Apple, like they are extremely closed platform. And they can do that because they own the software, the hardware, the distribution. Yeah. All right. I'll do this fast. And we start seeing that today with Facebook. And actually Facebook, I would say, is a very like particular person that we need to keep in mind, because they're making huge moves towards metaverse. So like last week, I don't know how many of you saw, but like Zuck came out and said that Facebook will be a metaverse company in 5 years. And he told that to all the investors. He told that to Wall Street. And it's like a bold claim. It's not like we'll build a Snapchat clone. It's like we are pivoting the whole $1 trillion business to be a metaverse company. They have like 10,000 worth of AR in the metaverse, which is 17% of their companies today, and they own hardware and distribution. And kind of like the most threatening part is that it doesn't really seem like he will necessarily believe in the open metaverse either. So he did say in his most recent press release that he does, but like his actions for the past years have not been that, where he is actually like acquiring all the biggest VR companies. And like Facebook themselves is like the main builder by far on their platform. Or like in the past, you've seen him use his control of the distribution in a way to like give themselves a upper hand. So I guess really the question here is like, how will open platforms win, given that like let's say there isn't any special developments. Facebook will own VR. That is a large part of probably the future metaverse. I think that really it's about like the open metaverse needs to be a big enough deal before Facebook gets too far with VR. So I think my exact example there with Apple was like they put browsers in the iPhone. They probably very much would have loved to like own the whole thing, but the web was a big enough deal that they had to do that. My estimation there is like 5 to 7 years at least until VR headsets are there's enough people who have them. It's important. And what this looks like is it could be like interoperation and network effects across other big players. There are a lot of them out there that could be relevant, like Roblox, Fortnite, Reddit, and maybe Gather. And of course, like lots of new players, lots of crypto startups, where it can make the platform as a whole like a big enough deal that anyone needs to care about it. One question that I always ask nowadays is like, how can Gather help speed up the process of this open metaverse, the rest of the ecosystem? Yeah, but that's kind of it. I know we're like really short on time, so maybe a couple questions or so, but yeah. Yeah, we can talk over there. All right, Camille. Thanks for
Sorry, I didn't realize we had a time limit. I just like kept talking.
Oh yeah, we're in a co-working space. We're getting kicked out.
Got you. Okay. Well, thanks everyone.
All right, see you, Camille.
Oh, I have some questions. I'll pose them to Telegram though, because I know we've got the dinner reservation.
Cool.